Do you ever wonder how things got where they are? How we got to the point where everything medicalized seems to be all that's accepted, and trying to do anything natural makes you feel like you're a villain, either in birth or just in wellness in general? Well, today I want to take you back a little over 100 years to a document that almost nobody talks about, but every one of us living lives with the consequences of. It's called the Flexner Report, or at least that's what it's commonly known by. It was published in 1910, and it completely reshaped everything about our medical system. It changed how doctors were trained, what kind of medicine it counts, who gets to be a doctor, and how birth moved from home into the hospital. If you've ever wondered why natural medicine is treated like quackery, why midwives and home births were completely wiped off the map, essentially, and why your doctor might have, 3, 4, 5 minutes with you in an appointment and no time to talk about nutrition. If you've wondered why you feel like a number or a problem instead of a whole person, this episode is going to give you a huge aha moment. Not so that you're scared, but so that you are equipped. Because once you understand the system that you are in, you can stop blaming yourself and you can start making more intentional, God honoring choices, knowing what you're working with. So grab your water or your coffee or your tea, and let's get started on learning more about how we got where we are. Let's go. Welcome to If Mama Ain't Healthy, Ain't Nobody Healthy. I'm your host, Lori Morris, a Christian midwife, mama of 3, and wellness coach who believes your body isn't broken, it's beautifully designed by God. Here we talk about how to restore your energy, balance your hormones, and find peace and true wellness in your body again, no matter what stage of motherhood you're in. Whether you're pregnant, postpartum, in the messy middle of mom life, or you're trying to conceive. And we do it all through biblical truth and practical, holistic living. Because you're not meant to just survive motherhood, you're meant to thrive in it. Let's dive in. Before we get started, I am all caught up on reviews. It's been a while since anybody has taken the time to go and leave me a written review over on Apple Podcasts. So I'm asking you today, if you are listening and you've been blessed by this podcast in any way, if you will head over to Apple Podcasts and leave me a quick review. It takes like 30 seconds. You will get to hear your review read right here on a future podcast, but it also encourages me and it helps me to find other moms like you. It doesn't cost you a thing, but a couple of minutes of your time, a few seconds of your time, and it helps me and encourages me so much. So go do that now. If you haven't already, just hit pause. I'll wait right here for you, okay? All right, moving on. So as I alluded to in the introduction, today we're going to talk about how we got where we are, because sometimes it can just be very discouraging and sometimes it can feel like that we just kind of landed here. And that's actually not true. There was some pretty methodical things that were done over time through history that have gotten us to where we went from completely out of hospitals to completely in hospitals for nearly everything. So I want to talk to you today about how that happened. Okay. So to get started, let's just think about how things used to be before 1910. And I know seems like a long time ago for most of us, but it really wasn't that long ago. Most of our grandparents lived in this time. Okay. Or maybe great grandparents. My grandmother was born in 1921. So just right after this, things had really started to change. And so her parents were in this, my great grandparents. It seems a long time, but it's really not very long at all in the grand scheme of things. So before 1910, American medicine was very pluralistic, and some would call it messy even. People had lots of options, but nothing was standardized. And while some see standardization as a good thing, we know now that standardization has led us to this point where we've lost all of our choices. See, before the Flexner Report, medicine in the United States was wild. There wasn't just one right way to practice medicine. There were lots of options. There were homeopathic schools. There were eclectic and botanical medicine schools where they learned how to use herbs and plant-based remedies, not to mention the fact that everybody's grandma had all kinds of remedies for anything that came up, and it was just well known. Those things, of course, have since died, as we'll learn. Naturopathic and osteopathic schools existed. There were community healers, there were herbalists, and of course, there were midwives who attended a majority of births for ordinary women. That was just what was normal. Women were used to having babies at home. They were used to calling on the community midwife to come help them when the time came. Or maybe not even an official midwife, but just the woman in the community who had been to the most births, usually one or two, or maybe more than that, would just get really good at attending births because they were the ones that enjoyed doing it and they were the ones who were always called on. Medical schools themselves were all over the place, and some were attached to universities, but some were small proprietary schools that were owned by just maybe one or two physicians. Many had low standards, and that's what some people kind of get caught up on. They had low standards, and so some actually were subpar. But it was a time when non-drug, hands-on, nature-based approaches were still on the table. It was a lot of passing down of knowledge that they just had from the things that they had seen through life. It was a time where remedies and traditional treatments were passed down from generation to generation. By around 1900, doctors were attending about half of the births, but mostly just for middle and upper class women, and most were still not in the hospital. Midwives were eventually put to the point where they were primarily serving poor immigrant and rural women through a witch hunt of sorts where doctors gave the impression that only poor people would ever see midwives, that anyone who had the means would obviously choose to see a doctor who was well trained. But meanwhile, doctors were only trained in medicine. Most of them were not trained in birth, had not seen birth, did not know how birth worked. And so they really actually weren't the better choice. But through a big, we'll call it marketing, also propaganda campaign, they had caused people to be scared of going to midwives. Less than 5% of births happened in hospitals. Doctors were still, the births they were attending were still happening at home, but they were slowly becoming the more dominant birth attendant, despite the fact that they had not shown any evidence that they were actually better at it. Okay, this is in the time leading up to the report that we're going to talk about today. So there were problems, real problems. There were problems with training. There were problems with dirty conditions in some cases, sometimes interventions that were straight up dangerous. But it was a world where birth and basic care were still rooted in homes and communities and in women's networks and how women cared for the community. So then came what's now known as the Flexner Report. It was a report that standardized medicine around one model with huge consequences. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation published a book-length survey called the Medical Education, or excuse me, called, there wasn't a V in there, just called Medical Education in the United States and in Canada. We now just call it the Flexner Report after its author, Abraham Flexner. Flexner was not a physician. He was an education specialist. He traveled around visiting 150 plus medical schools, grading them and recommending which ones deserved to survive. His core message was this, that we need fewer medical schools, we need higher standards for admission and graduation, and we should center everything on laboratory science, physiology, and biochemistry. He was heavily influenced by Johns Hopkins, sound familiar, right? Which became his gold standard model. He recommended that proprietary schools, which were little independent schools owned by doctors, should be closed or absorbed into universities. Medical education should be 4 years long with strict prerequisites, and teaching should be heavily lab-based and research-oriented. And on paper, that sounds great, right? It sounds like, hey, this isn't a bad thing. This is good. Higher education standards mean better training, right? They mean more science. That's good, right? And there were real benefits. But here's the part we don't talk about. Flexner and the foundations behind him didn't just describe the landscape. They picked the winners and the losers. And then they poured money into the winners. Where did that money come from? Well, after the report, Rockefeller and Carnegie, names I'm sure you've heard of, their money flowed to schools that matched the Flexner ideal. Schools that didn't match that ideal, or they couldn't match that ideal, if they couldn't adapt, if they couldn't fit into the mold they were told was the best one, especially small ones, rural ones. By the way, I've always hated that word. I struggle with it, rural. Schools, Black schools, homeopathic schools, naturopathic schools, and women's schools were left to die. Flexner openly derided forms of medical education that he considered unscientific, including homeopathy, eclectic medicine, and other botanical therapies. So this wasn't a neutral so-called quality check. It was a massive reordering of who gets to count as being legitimate medicine. And it wasn't just bad schools that closed. It was a coordinated squeeze by taking away funding, accreditation, and licensing. Let's talk numbers here, because this is where you're going to see how dramatic it actually was. In 1904, there were about 160 medical schools in the US, graduating over 28,000 students. By 1920, that number had dropped to 85 schools, so it dropped almost by half in 16 years. By 1935, only 66 medical schools were still operating. That's a loss of more than half of all medical schools in just a couple of decades. One analysis estimates that the report recommended closing more than 120 of the 150 plus schools operating at the time that he had gone and visited or he had graded. This wasn't just trimming the fat per se. It was a mass extinction event for the whole tradition, all the traditional fields of healing. So how did they actually make it happen? Well, there were three big levers to this whole thing. The first was philanthropic funding. After Flexner published his report, the Rockefeller General General Education Board and the Carnegie Foundation started heavily funding only those schools who matched the new model. If you were a small school teaching homeopathic remedies or homeopathic treatments, eclectic medicine, or if you were serving poor or Black communities, you didn't get that money. And without it, many schools simply could not stay open. There was also a partnership that forms between the AMA, the American Medical Association, and accreditation. So Flexner traveled with representatives from the AMA's Council on Medical Education. And the AMA's list and ratings combined with Flexner's report effectively became the blueprint for which schools were considered legitimate. So they had to meet what these two groups said they had to meet, or they were deemed illegitimate, whether or not they actually were. Schools were told that they were to drop all alternative medical content or lose support and recognition. So they had no choice if they wanted to continue to exist. And then the third lever was state licensing boards. Even today, we continue battling this or having this battle where we think that licensure means legitimacy. Really, it doesn't. It was just part of this whole thing. Think about that. Flexner emphasized that state medical boards had to enforce these new standards. And over time, state boards adopted the report's criteria. So if your school didn't meet them, then your graduates could not get their medical licenses to be able to practice. So no license meant no practice. So even if your community loved you, you were no longer seen as legitimate. Midwives today still fight that same thing. They may be the best care provider for birth that ever was. But if they don't have a certain licensure, they're not seen as legitimate. If the state doesn't say that they meet the criteria that the state says that they need, then they're seen as illegitimate. It's amazing if you really dig into it, because we have all more or less adopted this thought process that licensure equals legitimacy. And we don't even know that we're playing into the hand that was dealt to us by these organizations who were not in it for our good overall. So between money, accreditation, and licensing, they didn't have to literally pass a law banning these schools. They just made it nearly impossible to survive outside this new system. The closures hit certain targets the hardest, and I've mentioned most of them already. Homeopathic, naturopathic, eclectic, and botanical schools were derided and either forced to conform to the new standards or to go away. Black medical schools also were targeted. Of 7 historically Black medical schools that existed when this began, 5 were closed. The only ones that survived were Howard and Meharry. Meharry, ironically, is right around the corner, literally around the corner from where I went to high school. And even those 2 schools struggled to meet new standards without major outside funding. Many schools that trained women were downgraded or closed, which also contributed to fewer women in medicine. Flexner explicitly wrote that Black physicians should be trained mainly in hygiene, not surgery, and should function as sanitarians to protect white communities from disease. And that was real life in these times. So we're not just talking about raising standards, we're talking about race, class, and gender being baked into who gets to be called a doctor. Flexner further weakened midwifery and obstetrics training, and then early in the 20th century, obstetric leaders finished the job by reframing birth as pathology and pushing it into hospitals. See, in the Flexner Report itself, obstetrics did not fare well, obstetrics being the study of medicine around birth. Flexner wrote that obstetrics made the, quote, the very worst showing, end quote, among medical specialties, criticizing poor training and low standards. So what did that mean practically? Well, obstetrics needed to be modernized and brought under physician control. Midwives were largely ignored in the report, but the effect of raising educational and licensing standards for doctors without creating a path for midwives pushed them further into the margins than they already were, as we discussed a little bit earlier. At the same time, midwives lacked formal professional organizations. They had little legal recognition, and they faced prejudice as poor immigrant or non-English speaking women. So when Flexner elevated the university-trained physician as the standard, midwifery became even easier to push aside. So let's look at how quickly this really changed. Again, back to the numbers we talked about earlier, but wrapping in some new things. Around 1900, doctors, again, they did attend half of the births, but less than 5% of the births were in the hospitals. Even when the doctors were attending the births, they were still at home. By 1921, about 30 to 50% of births were happening inside of hospitals. So that's just 21 years. And then by 1939, about 50% of all women and 75% of urban women were giving birth in hospitals. So in less than 40 years, birth went from being almost entirely home-based to largely hospital-based. And why is that? Well, see, hospitals promised, quote, painless birth. Right. They promised painless birth with new anesthesia methods and twilight sleep, which was introduced around 1914. Hopefully you've heard about twilight sleep and what a bad deal that was. But see, women didn't know that. And they just knew that birth sounded pretty awful because everybody had made it sound so painful, and the doctors make it seem like that they could come save them from these problems. And so this painless birth, it sounded pretty good. Doctors framed midwives as being dirty, uneducated, and dangerous, while protecting themselves by portraying themselves as modern and scientific. Urbanization and apartment living made home care more difficult because by this time the urbanization, bringing everybody into cities, they weren't necessarily out in their own homes, and hospitals became more accessible with good roads and cars. One of the loudest voices in this shift is a name we still hear on birth floors every day because his name is plastered on some of the tools that we use, and his name was Dr. Joseph DeLay, a very influential obstetrician in the early 1900s. He's not Flexner, but he was working in the same era. And in a 1915 paper, DeLay called midwives a, quote, relic of barbarism, and a, quote, drag on the progress, I promise I can read, drag on the progress of science and art, on the science and art of obstetrics. So I butchered that pretty good trying to read a quote. Forgive me for that, but hopefully you got the gist that DeLay was starting the process of making midwives seem completely illegitimate and as a dangerous person to trust with your birth. He argued that childbirth was not a normal function, but it was a pathological process that needed aggressive management. He proposed a standard routine for, quote, ideal births that included heavy sedation, routine forceps delivery. Forceps are like, they're pieces of metal that you put in, think like a shoehorn almost, but it goes one on each side of the baby's head to help slide the baby out. That supposedly was a good thing in his view. So routine forceps deliveries, episiotomies, active management of the placenta, and uterotonic drugs. That means to give the uterus tone. By the way, if you are intimidated by hearing these names and not knowing what they mean, I actually talk about all of these things in the online childbirth education course. These are all things that are still actively alive in hospital birth today. And you need to know what these things are, like the forceps. I talk about that. I explain that. I show pictures of that. And so if you are intimidated by this, and if you are like, wow, I didn't know all this stuff existed, this seems so old. No, it's still there day in and day out in every hospital in America. So if you are feeling that, oh no, I don't know what these things are, that course is for you. You can learn all about these things. The course is about nutrition and staying low risk and birth and breastfeeding and all the things you need to know to have a great birth. Yes, but I'll also go into all of these interventions that you're going to want to avoid, and I help you understand them so you know why to avoid them. So I just want to put that in there, that course is still available for you, and you can find that at go.yourbirthgodsway.com/CEC. So all of those things that supposedly made birth so much better were done in hospitals under the control of male physicians, because remember, women had been squeezed out. This became the template for birth in the 1920s and the 1930s, and honestly, on into today. As one historian put it, the move to hospital birth completed the transformation of childbirth into a medical event requiring risk management. Birth was no longer normal, no longer natural, but now it was a disease and a pathology that needed to be treated. So you might think, okay, that sounds intense, but maybe it saved more lives. Here's the truth. Maternal mortality did not significantly decline between 1915 and 1930, despite more hospital births, more prenatal care, and more aseptic technique, meaning keeping things sterile and clean. Infant deaths from birth injuries actually increased by 40 to 50% between 1915 and 1929 because of excessively or poorly performed interventions, things like those forceps that I talked about a minute ago. Those things caused deaths because these doctors didn't know what they were doing. In other words, moving birth into the hospital put doctors in charge, but it didn't automatically make it safer, especially in the early decades. It often meant just more intervention, more trauma, and more risk, particularly for women whose bodies might have done just fine with skilled physiologic support from midwives. And midwives who often had better outcomes for normal births were pushed out and outright outlawed in some places. Our system that we have today is the logical outcome of Flexner in the early 20th century obstetrics. It is not a random accident. It was planned. So what are we left with? What can we do after all this? Not what can we do, but what are we left with to deal with after all this? What are we left to function inside of? Well, we now have a monopoly model. Doctors are the primary gatekeepers of what is seen as legitimate medicine, whether or not it actually is. A system where pharmaceuticals and procedures are central, and nutrition, lifestyle, and natural therapies are sidelined. We're left with a maternity care system where birth is assumed to be dangerous until proven otherwise. And interventions are the norm, not the exception. There are deep racial inequities even today because Black medical schools were decimated and Black physicians were kept out of the mainstream for decades. So, when you feel rushed in your little 3-minute appointment slot, you feel pressured into an induction or an intervention you're not at peace about, when you feel dismissed when you ask about nutrition or natural options, or when you're just told, just trust the system, it's for your own good, and you know in your gut that's not right, you're not crazy. You're bumping up against a system designed over 100 years ago with very specific priorities, and you're flourishing as a whole person, body and soul, was not at the top of that list. In fact, it was nowhere on the list at all. They weren't concerned about it. They were concerned about their new technology that they wanted you to believe was better because they stood to profit from it. Now, I always want to bring everything that we talk about in this podcast back to the Lord. God is not anti-science. God is the author of truth. But Scripture calls us to things like discernment. Proverbs 15:14 says, "The discerning heart seeks knowledge." Wisdom, not just information, but applying the information and the knowledge that we get to the decisions that we make. Honoring our bodies as a temple of the, or as the temple of the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. God designed our bodies with built-in healing processes. Pregnancy and birth, he built as physiological processes, not automatic emergencies. It's how he designed human life to continue on earth. It was the process that he designed. And as such, it is not pathological. It is normal. God also designed community and relationship as part of how we're cared for, not just some top-down authority where it's doctors and only doctors, and they're the only ones who can know anything. So asking questions about the medical system, thinking about it, learning about your birth options, about medications and interventions, this is not rebellion. This is not being anti-science. This is obedience to God's call to seek wisdom. And it is also loving him and honoring him because he's the one that made us. He put us together. He is the mastermind behind the brilliant design of how a human body works. And so seeking him and seeking his wisdom and how we care for these bodies is honoring him. So what do you do with all this information? You got all this knowledge now. You're probably a little mad about it, understandably so. But what do? First, I want to relieve a little bit of shame. If you have felt, why didn't I know any of this before my birth? Or why didn't anybody tell me I had options? Or why does it feel so hard to get help that looks at the root cause of what's going on? If you feel like maybe you made bad choices in the past because you didn't have the full information, understand it is because the system you are in was never designed to empower you. It was designed to standardize, centralize, and control everything about the care that you receive. Let that strengthen your resolve to seek care that aligns with God's design, that gives you true informed consent, that listens to your voice as a mother, and that gives a whole person approach to health. It may mean that you choose a midwife or a more holistic provider for your care. I hope that it does. It may mean that you ask more questions and you tell your provider, I need time to think about what you've told me, and not just blindly going along with what they recommend. It may mean that you look for care that integrates nutrition, nervous system support, and spiritual health. And again, I hope that it does, because that's the only way to be truly well. It may mean that you build a community around you instead of walking this road alone. And as you know, I've got the answer for you there. If you're listening and thinking, okay, Lori, this explains so much, and I know I can't keep trying to figure this out alone, I want to invite you into the next 2 steps that will optimize your health. First, I am building a Christ-centered wellness community called Verity Village. Verity means truth, and there is so much truth already loaded there. I'm loading things daily to be ready for you when the doors open. It is full of information to give you the wisdom that you need to make better decisions. And it's a place for Christian women to learn, to heal, and to grow together, body and soul, in alignment with God's design. Again, it is not quite ready yet. As I record this, we are getting into December. It is a busy time for you, and it is a busy time for me. And we've had some sickness in the family, and so I've just been doing the best that I can. But I am hoping to have this ready in the next couple of weeks. So if you haven't already, you need to get on that waiting list so that you're the first to find out about it and you get that founder's discount. So it's basically just me getting everything ready for you. And I appreciate your patience with me as it takes a little longer than I had wanted to. But I want you to get on that wait list now. You can do that at https://www.morriswellnessservices.com/village waiting. When you're on that list, you're going to get early access and a special discount just for the founding members when the doors open. Second, if you're listening and thinking, I know I need help from her, I know I need somebody to help me make sense of all this. My labs, my symptoms, my blood sugar, my hormones, my fatigue, all of these things that just don't seem to make sense, especially if all of those things, according to your doctor, have come back normal and you're fine. But you know you're not fine. You know something's not right. You know that they're missing something. If that is you, if you find yourself saying those things and thinking those things, and that's exactly what I do in my one-on-one coaching mentorship program. I work with a small number of women in a high-touch way to look deeply into your history and into your labs. I address root causes like insulin resistance, inflammation, stress, nervous system overload, and I create a realistic plan that honors your life as a mom, your life as a Christian, and it puts all of the pieces together in a way that will make it finally make sense for you so you can finally start feeling like you know you ought to feel. If that's you, you can apply to work with me at https://www.morriswellnessservices.com/apply. You'll just fill out a few short questions, and then you will book a call with me where we'll just hop on a call and we will talk through what's going on with you to see if we're a good fit and to see if this program is what you need. And you will be well on your way to having that healing that you know you should have. But maybe the medical system has been telling you you're crazy, everything's fine, your numbers are fine, and you know that you're not. You know something's wrong. This program is for you. So go hop on both of those links. I'll put them in the show notes as well if you would rather do that so you don't have to type them in. Get signed up, and you will be on your way to making 2026 the year when you finally get well. I'll talk to you again right here next week. If you were blessed by today's episode, please take a minute to share it with another mama friend you know needs this info, or post a screenshot on your Instagram stories and tag me so I'll know you loved this episode. Then come hop into our Facebook group to find your people and have some like-minded support throughout your week. Also, I'd love it if you'd head to YouTube and subscribe to my channel. You can find links for all of these things in the show notes. I'm so thankful for you, and I look forward to hanging out again with you right here next week.